Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appreciate the opportunity to speak. I returned from Ukraine earlier this week, where I saw both the suffering that the Ukrainian people have endured over the past 3 years at Putin's hand, and the courage they have forged to save their country and their children. The suburban town of Bucha, where Russian troops tortured and massacred hundreds of civilians in the first day of Putin's unprovoked invasion. The shattered children's hospital Putin's missiles nearly destroyed. Apartment buildings in central Kyiv struck by Putin's drones, and lawyers searching for the thousands of Ukrainian children who have been kidnapped from their parents by Russian soldiers. By most estimates, at least 40,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed in battle, and another 380,000 have been wounded since Putin's invasion. A draft of the general population in that country means that war has scarred nearly every neighborhood in this massive country. In cemeteries all across Ukraine, fresh graves piled with dirt and flowers testify to their sacrifice. At least 12,000 civilians have been killed. Amid this torment, the Ukrainian people continue to send troops to the front in the dead of winter and to mobilize to keep their businesses and their homes and their kids in school. They did not ask for Putin's thuggish invasion. And from the very beginning, our intelligence agencies have told us something that Putin never has understood, that the Ukrainian people will never submit to him, that if every weapon were denied them, they would fight with sticks and stones and their bare hands to protect their country from any invading tyrant, but especially from Vladimir Putin of Russia. Fortunately for Ukraine and for the rest of the free world, they have not had to fight this invasion with their bare hands. The American people have steadfastly supported them. We have sent $66 billion in military aid and $51 billion in non-military aid. That's a lot of money, Mr. President, but it represents just 0.52% of our GDP. Unlike the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, not a single American soldier has been sent to fight. Our European allies have stepped up as well. Together, they've actually committed more than the United States. But their sums represent a much larger percentage of their economies, which makes sense because they are closer to the danger that Russia poses. And at the same time, even farther allies like Australia and Japan continue to support Ukraine as well. Our allies and our partners know the stakes of this war. They know that supporting Ukraine means standing with people that are willing to fight for the country that they love. They know that rolling over to Putin will embolden other dictators around the world, especially Xi Jinping of China. The rest of us may not need this reminder, Mr. President, but the people sitting at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue apparently do, since they seem to be the only ones in the free world who do not understand the stakes of this war. Over the last few days, President Trump has chosen the side of tyranny, of Putin, of Xi, and profoundly undermined our national security. Like someone reading Russian Twitter bots, he deliberately and falsely accused Ukraine of starting the war. He called Zelensky, the freedom fighter who's leading the fight in Ukraine, a dictator. Mr. President, he invited Russia to rejoin the G7, a group of the world's most powerful democracies that has met regularly since the 1970s, and which threw out Russia after Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014. before negotiations have even started. Mr. President, President Trump's Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, took Ukraine's potential NATO membership off the table. And just this week, the Trump administration held talks with Russia in Saudi Arabia without the decency of even inviting Ukraine to the table. It pains me to say it, but our old colleague, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, even suggested that the United States should lift sanctions on and bolster economic collaboration with Russia while Russia shells civilians in Ukraine. Some of our Republican colleagues believe it doesn't matter what President Trump says, only what he does. That it doesn't matter when he says that he's going to send American troops to Gaza, or seize the Panama Canal, or falsely accuse Ukraine of starting this war. But a president's words matter more than most, and President Trump's harmful words and policies will only embolden Putin. They will further convince Putin that he is winning, that time is on his side, and that he has no reason to accept a peace deal that is anything less than overwhelmingly favorable to his maximalist desires. In literally every one of his comments on Ukraine, President Trump has undermined our national security. Every time he opens his mouth, he weakens our bargaining position and makes the world more dangerous. We all want this war to end. On that, the President and I agree. But for the sake of Ukraine and the sake of the free world, it must only end with a just and enduring peace. While the United States and our allies and Ukraine work together to establish the terms of the peace and to get ready to negotiate with Putin, the Ukrainians are going to have to keep fighting throughout this winter season, this freezing winter, where the civilian population is just doing everything they can to keep their houses and their businesses and their schools warm and livable. The Ukrainian soldiers are not asking to be relieved of this terrible burden. They are embracing it because they know that any ceasefire without meaningful security guarantees will allow Putin to rebuild his weakened army and attack again and again and again. And obviously, everyone in this chamber knows that any meaningful negotiation has to include Ukraine. Doing anything else, as the Trump administration just did in Saudi Arabia, would be an insult to the memory of every soldier who's laid down their life in this war. I cannot claim, Mr. President, to know Donald Trump well. It is obvious that I deeply regret his election. But I don't blame him for winning the election. He beat my party, the Democratic Party, badly in 2 elections. He even found a way to get elected after he was the first president in American history to take away a fundamental civil right from the American people, a woman's right to choose, and still got elected again. That is extraordinary. And it is a testament, I'm sorry to say, to the Democratic Party's weaknesses and to his own skills and talents. Particularly in this era, I don't doubt that his experience as a reality TV star taught him things that helped him get elected. I am much less certain, however, that his checkered commercial real estate background prepared him to negotiate a hotel deal with Vladimir Putin, much less a deal that concerns the fate of the free world. Donald Trump is not the only person, Mr. President, with private sector experience in our government. I can tell you from my experience working in Denver, when someone is having a negotiation who has deal fever, you can see it, you can smell it when they are so desperate for a deal on any terms. The people that I negotiated with in Denver had a lot more discipline than that. We told each other that we would never agree to any deal that hadn't cratered at least 3 times, because that was the only way you could tell whether you were getting the best deal. If you didn't have the guts to walk away, Mr. President, you were never going to get the best deal that you could. I have never seen a worse case of deal fever than Donald Trump's approach to the coming negotiation with Vladimir Putin. Never in my life have I seen it, and it's never been more important. I doubt the world has seen such an ill-conceived pursuit of negotiation since the infamous 1938 Munich Agreement, in which the UK and France and Italy allowed Nazi Germany to annex part of Czechoslovakia. And the damage he's doing is not only that we will get a worse deal, it's that we will undermine Ukraine's position on the front lines. Without security guarantees from the United States and from Europe, Putin will only bide his time, regroup, and invade again. After the fictions that President Trump has spewed about who started this war, not to mention the chorus of defeatism from his vice president, his secretary of defense, and the director of national intelligence, does anybody, including Putin and Xi Jinping, doubt what would happen if Putin invaded again? This is less the art of the deal, Mr. President, I'm afraid, than it is the art of defeat. After all these years, after all these battles, it would be truly pathetic for the United States, the world's most powerful country, to accept a fever-induced deal with Russia, like the Munich Agreement. Look it up, not perhaps on Twitter, but in your much more reliable 10th grade Western Civ textbook. After that deal, Hitler did not stop in Czechoslovakia, but continued his war on Europe. And left unchecked, Putin will do the same thing. Putin's propagandists have told us repeatedly, and to make matters worse, anyone concerned about Beijing's potential takeover of Taiwan knows that there will be no better test of how the free world will respond to Xi's potential invasion than how we respond to Putin's. Come to think of it, if China does invade Taiwan, how would we evaluate the leadership capacity of an American president who claimed that it was Taiwan who had invaded China, not the other way around? That is the level of duplicity that we are seeing from Donald Trump right now. So, why the deal fever? That's a good question, Mr. President. President Trump's aspiration for a Nobel Peace Prize is well known. He can hang it next to his gold-plated faucets and his first editions of The Art of the Deal. But if he heard from people in this chamber, even he might think twice if he understood that walking down this path of appeasement makes him more likely to be remembered like Neville Chamberlain. Negotiations can end this war in a just matter only if Ukraine can negotiate them from a place of strength. The American people have been incredibly generous in our support of Ukraine. But even so, this war has cost us less than 0.6% of our GDP, while allowing us to send Ukraine old weapons when we invest in our own cutting-edge replacement, permitting us to learn from Ukraine's extraordinary innovation on the front lines and its world-class use of new warfighting technologies such as drones, and boosting our economy without costing a single American soldier's life. We and our European allies have to continue surging military assistance to Ukraine, not forever, but so Ukraine is best positioned to make this deal, not just for Ukraine, but for us and for free countries all over the world. And contrary to what many people believed at the outset of this war and what President Trump apparently believes today, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been costly to him, very costly to him. 3 years of the Ukrainian people's tenacity and courage have degraded the Russian military. As we speak, Russia is losing twice the number of soldiers every month as Putin's war continues. In total, Putin has squandered more than $200 billion and suffered a staggering 700,000 casualties at the hands of Ukrainian patriots. 3 times the number of soldiers Russia lost in Afghanistan, a country famously regarded as the graveyard of empires. We didn't ask for this war, neither did Ukraine. But Putin is in a weaker position to threaten Europe today than when he first swung his iron fist at the Ukrainian people. The last thing we should do now is weaken our negotiating position when we and Europe have so much at stake, when the world has so much at stake. Putin believes he can beat Ukraine not because he thinks Ukrainians are weak, but because he thinks we are weak. And he thinks President Trump is a pushover and a sucker. At the beginning of his invasion of Ukraine, Putin, who is surrounded, as tyrants are and dictators are, by yes men who are scared to tell him the truth about their own weaknesses, and in this case, Russia's weaknesses, made 3 fundamental miscalculations going into the war. One was about the strength of his own army. He had invested billions of dollars planning for the invasion, but much of it was siphoned off because of Russia's endemic corruption. The second miscalculation was about the Ukrainian people's patriotism and willingness to fight to the death. No matter how President Trump tries to undermine this sacrifice, the honor roll of history will forever record Ukraine's courage. Putin's third miscalculation was that the world would roll over and allow him to invade his peaceful neighbor. Unlike the other 2 mistakes, he had evidence for the final point. After all, when he began his invasion in 2014 by lawlessly sending his little green men to occupy Crimea, which is part of Ukraine, the world did nothing. The United States did nothing. He thought the world would do nothing when he invaded again. It turned out, unlike Putin, we actually learned from our mistake. The free world has stood up to Putin this time around. We have supplied arms and other support while the Ukrainian people have died on the front line of their country and for the West. Their cemeteries are bulging with fresh graves. They have earned the free world's support. But even more important to us and our allies, we have protected our national security and affirmed our commitment to the post-World War II rules-based international order. How this ends will determine whether that order persists and whether the United States continues to provide the leadership our parents and grandparents supplied since World War II. World War II was another war started by a tyrant, but it was ended by the world's democracies. Many Americans inside this chamber and outside understand the stakes. They know, as Ronald Reagan proclaimed 40 years ago, in advancing freedom, Americans carry a special burden, a belief in the dignity of man, and that freedom is America's core and that we should never deny it nor forsake it. This is what we risk today by withdrawing our support of Ukraine. We will abandon both the Ukrainian people and the core of what America stands for, and we cannot do it, Mr. President. This is personal for me and so many of us. My mom was born a Jew in Warsaw in 1938. She and her parents and an aunt were the only ones who survived the Holocaust. The Nazis killed everyone else in her family. Authoritarian aggression left an indelible mark on my family and countless other families in Ukraine and Poland in the 1930s and 1940s, where Stalin and Hitler killed together 16 million human beings. These victims of fascism died believing that they were invisible to the rest of the world, forgotten people in unforgettable years. The lesson I learned from my mom is that the United States can never let that happen again by trying to appease a dictator the way that Chamberlain did. That is not apocryphal or a made-up story. I had dinner last night with my mom. She is 86 years old, Mr. President. She can't believe that she's lived long enough. I'm happy that she has, but she can't believe that she's lived long enough to see another tyrant's invasion of their peaceful, democratic, European neighbor. But she hasn't lived long enough to forget her generation's searing lessons. She knows the eternal truth that the greatest enemy of fascism is man. Even if President Trump continues to ignore reality, my mother and millions of Americans who make up the greatest generation understand the United States has a special responsibility here. It has always been far too easy for some in high office to ignore their moral responsibility to people sacrificing their lives a continent away on behalf of our shared values and interests. History occasionally records their name like Chamberlain's in blood. It is particularly easy today to play to self-defeating isolationist tendencies and the daily headlines, to make rash comments that are foolish and unpatriotic, and that Russian trolls spread like wildfire across social media platforms. It's far too easy to do the wrong thing. It always has been, Mr. President. It's a lot harder, but it's necessary for the living to stand for freedom and democracy, and those willing to give the last measure of themselves for those eternal values. At this moment, the United States is the only country who can lead the free world against these dictators, against these tyrants. The Americans who serve in this chamber, Mr. President, must fulfill our responsibility to the American people and demand the President fulfill his patriotic responsibility in the days ahead. Everything now, Mr. President, is in our hand. The moment demands that the United States of America lead for the sake of the Ukrainian people, for our own national security, and for democracy around the world. Our failure will not just be damaging, Mr. President, it will be devastating. I yield the floor.